Brother Embodiment, it's an honor to meet you and have you at my home.
Thank you.
Because your father is a legend in America, especially at City College where I come from.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you for having me on.
You're welcome. So we're going to talk a little bit about our history, pre-USA. And you're Igbo man.
That's correct.
That's a powerful nation. I'm from a place in South Carolina, and so some of our ancestors are also Igbos. They call us Geechee and Gullah people, and we live along the coast. It starts really in North Carolina and goes all the way down the coast of Florida, halfway down Florida. The Gullah Geechee Nation is a people who are mixed from Angola, Congo, Igbos, Yoruba, Akans, and some Egyptian people who were driven out by the Turks in the 10th century and made it to the west by the 15th century, and the British captured us and brought us there. But one of the big nations that came to that area was the Igbo nation, because in the wars that the British had in Nigeria, they conquered everybody. They even defeated the Yoruba, because the Yoruba was in that civil war with themselves, and they really helped defeat it themselves. But when it came to the Igbo, they couldn't get a handle on the Igbo people because you didn't have a centralized administration. So they couldn't kill the chief and sack the capital, and you didn't have a centralized theocracy. The spiritual system of the Igbo, of course, you had your sacred groves. And so they didn't know where to find the gods until eventually somebody did inform, and they began to burn the sacred groves, burn them down. And it was only then they were able to get a handle on the Igbo wars and captured many of the Igbo people. But when they brought them to America, hundreds of them with the chains on just turned around and walked back in the water and committed suicide. So they called that place Igbo landing, to remember them. Because they said, we will not be slaves to you. We die first. Go back to the ancestors and go back home. And so that's what they did. So our history is if you look at the system that they've offered us as democracy, it doesn't even come close to the systems that we have. You know that even in your language, when there's a man who you have to address that's older than you, but not your father, he's automatically your uncle. The language makes it such.
That's correct.
And the language is the key part of the culture. If there's a woman old enough to be your mother, but not your mother, that's your auntie. If the woman is young enough to be your sister, but not your blood, she's automatic in the language, your sister. So our language carry the culture. When people say, oh, we've lost our culture, no, we haven't. The language carries the culture. And we need to realize that if you go deep into the history of the Igbos, they will tell you about the great migration from the east, which I'm sure you may have heard from your elders. And in the great migration from the east, they're saying we are part of those peoples who built the Egyptian civilization. But when all of the invasions began to come, starting with the Hyksos invasion and the Hittite, then the Assyrians, and then from the Assyrians we get the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans, and then finally we get the Arabs and the Turks and the Muslims. They drove us out of those lands over centuries. And a big part of our community, though we merged with the indigenous population, which is in Nigeria, the larger population had migrated in from the east. And they brought with them those same cultural tools that they used to build ancient Egypt. A civilization that reigned for over at least 50,000 years. People say, oh, no, it's only 9,000 years. Well, the Egyptians created astrology. In order to create astrology, you must have studied astronomy for 25,000 years, because it takes that long for each of the constellations to move through time and come back to its original location. And no one can say something is a constant unless you've seen it at least twice. So that's the minimum has to be 50,000 years. Minimum. Because you've had to see it twice to say, that works. That might be Dr. J. So what we've got to begin to understand about our religion.
Shall we get it?
Yes, I think that's Dr. Jeffries. is that our religion is so profound because you come from an old people. The Igbo people is the old people. You know why they adopted Christianity so easily? Because Christianity looked like the original system. It didn't look like an alien. It looked like our ancestors' thing. It had all of the parts that our ancient system had. So we need to understand, in our system it says that we came from God. And when we left heaven, we made a deal with God that we would come to earth and we would do certain things. And many of us run into trouble on earth because we didn't do what we made the deal to do. We created a destiny which we have unfulfilled. The other thing we know that we believe in reincarnation. But we don't believe in coming back as a snake or a tree or a bird. We come back in the same family we were originally born in. This is your tradition.
Yes.
And we come back as our grandfather or grandmother or uncle or auntie. And that's why the child is not outdoored immediately. We have to wait to see who has come.
Yes, indeed.
Before we can give a name to this child. And we need to know who has come so we can make them safe with our rituals before we present them to the world.
I came as my mother's uncle.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay.
And that's the title I go by. That's what everybody know me.
I came as my grandfather's brother.
Okay.
So that's why I'm James. That's Uncle James.
That's wonderful.
And so a lot of those traditions we actually kept here in America, but the people don't know where they came from. They think we created them here, but we didn't. So we even have this thing, and the Igbo have it too, where you have the second name. And we call it nicknames. I was just talking a little bit about the spiritual system of the Igbo, and he was concurring to me. We were talking when BrotherRonn says he's ready.
Because I think it's very important just to know, a lot of people don't understand how Egypt and how contemporary Egypt is related to Africa, to the central part of Africa or to the western part of that of the continent. They just think that Egyptians have always been and they've always been white.
Those Turks who invaded our land, that's Northeast Africa. Those people are Turks and Eastern European
Romans.
Greeks and Romans. They never went back home once we defeated them in each rush. They lose the war, but where are they going to go back to? They left there and invaded us because they didn't want to stay home. So they're not going to go back. So when we think of the Igbo people, a part of their tradition is the migrations from the east to the west. And at the point that I'd stopped discussing, we were talking about a part of the theocracy of the Igbo, where they say that we go and we come, that reincarnation is a centerpiece of Igbo tradition. But you come back in the same family you originally came into the earth in. And when you come back, as Brother Ibadawe was telling me, he is his mother's uncle, So he knows the system. I'm my grandfather's brother, So we practice the tradition over here, but most of us don't realize where the tradition comes from. And so we do this. We even have what we call nicknames, which is a name that is your character, which is different from the name you get when you are born. And so we thought it was something out of Europe. No. You get a name when you're born. Your name for the ancestor who has returned. But then you get a name that is, and that's sometimes the ancestor's name is kind of like your secret name. Nobody really calls you that except the elders in the house. You have another name that you would develop based on what your character is like, that your friends and all the others call you. That's what we call over here the nickname. So, but it's really an African tradition. It's an Igbo tradition that came in through the communities that we're from. And the other thing that's so extraordinary about the Igbo tradition, which is a lot like many of the other West African traditions, it doesn't just say you come back, but you have a certain amount of going and coming to perfect yourself before you join God again. And if you don't complete your task, then you go sit with your ancestors and they will work on you for some time, and then maybe you start the journey all over again. That's our theocracy. But many people don't teach it because they don't understand the essence of our
Life.
spiritual systems. And we have some of the most beautiful spiritual systems in the world. There's a story that people tell about the British when they came to Igbo land. And they were building a church. So they were working hard, these white men, chopping down trees and cutting them. And the Igbo men were sitting on a tree laughing at them. So the British man says, oh, those dumb Africans, they're lazy. They don't want to help build a house for God. The Igbo man says, oh, such stupid white man to think they can build a building big enough to hold God. You see? So when you think of the mind and where the mind is located in terms of how it's perceiving its reality, it depends on the culture of the ancestry. You know, your ancestral wisdom. That's what guides you through the world. If you lose that, you've lost your way. And what the Europeans have done in so many of our countries is block the flow of information intergenerationally. And if you can do that for 1 or 2 generations, then the people are in a deep conflict. You know? And so that's where we find ourselves now. So they can bring a system like Christianity, which was created in Africa. We didn't call it Christianity, but the model of regeneration and redemption. You see it in ancient Egypt, you see it in ancient Ethiopia, where a child is born to a woman by a god, and the child comes as the savior of the world. In Egypt, the child is called Heru, and the mother is called Aset, and God is called Asar. And this baby is born of an immaculate conception. There is no Christianity yet. Matter of fact, on the 11th of September every year, this is celebrated as the oldest new year in the world by the Ethiopian peoples, who are many of the peoples who migrated from Egypt when the invasion started coming. So when we begin to look at our common cultures, you see variations, but the variations is usually ecological. If you're in the desert, you got to use a different tool to make your point than if you're in the rainforest. If you're in the savannah, you got to use a different tool to make your point than you're in the desert or the rainforest, but you're making the same point, just a different tool. And we get confused and think the tool makes us different when we don't see the commonality of the idea that the tools represent. So Dr. J, we were saying, we were talking about our great legacy before leaving Africa, before colonialism, before slavery. And so maybe you want to elaborate on that legacy. I was just talking finitely about the Igbo people before the British started burning their sacred groves to try and get an advantage over them. And I talked about those that landed in South Carolina and Georgia, where the area is now called Igbo landing because they rather commit suicide than be enslaved, just to come close to his home. But you can give us a general view of African history before the enslavers came, before the Turks and the Arabs came, before the Western European came. We created civilizations. And all their great writers will tell you this. In ancient Egypt, if you read the Odyssey and the Iliad by Homer out of Greece, he says all of the gods of Greece have to return to Egypt every season to renew themselves at the feet of the gods of Africa. Herodotus, when he writes his book 2 on history, he says that 2 blackbirds, meaning female priestess from Africa, took the oracle system or the religious system from Africa to Greece and taught them that system. You know? And it goes on and on and on. Plato wrote a piece called Phaedrus, a dialogue he called Phaedrus. And in Phaedrus, Plato says that the Africans gave the world all of the sciences, and he spoke about Druze, arithmetic, geometry, medicine, but he said the greatest science of all that the Africans gave to the world was the science of writing itself. This is their big boy. This is Plato, and they don't even put this in the schools to tell me anything, you see. So when you think of just your ancestors, they were a part of those peoples that create that enormous civilization that lasted for at least 50,000 years. Just to account for astrology, you need 50,000 years. But think of all the other sciences we created.
Okay.
50,000 years.
So, well, taking up from where Dr. Small just, stopped, regarding the Igbo people as as a representative of the African continent and African people. It is true that the British found it difficult to overrun the Igbo land or to take over the Igbo land. As a matter of fact, they camped out for a very long time because they looked at the Igbo people, especially the Aro people, who were dominant in controlling of the vast resources of the land and the people, the trade in the area, because they thought that they would have had a very great army in order to be in control of a very vast area, not knowing that they were just in control with basically high intellect. You know, they had no army, so to speak. And eventually, when they summoned the courage and reinforcement of, you know, warships, gunships, and then came in, they found out that there wasn't any army, and it took them maybe a week to overcome it, but they had stayed they had laid siege for years and never moved in, okay? And so that's part of that culture and that history, you know, where people, like, in order to buttress, to support what you have said, demonstrated high intellect. And people with such high intellect, no doubt, would have had a whole lot of advancement in what we probably call technologies today, but technologies of those years, okay? And a lot of things have happened, I've noticed, like you talked about Jesus Christ, the religion, the current religion, and how people in Nigeria believe they're very religious. So many people say, oh, you are not a believer. They turn to me and they say, you're not a believer. Because I just simply, without saying too much, I just tell them, please, you know, I look at people based on how well you can keep the commandments of God. And that also the commandments of God is also the laws of man. Because if you look at the laws of the land, maybe the laws in America and the laws in Nigeria, they mirror the laws of God. And so being religious to me is more of keeping the law. If you're able to keep the law, be your neighbor's keeper, be a good friend to, you know, those such things, you would have maybe achieved 60% of what is required of one. So I keep
the moral laws.
The moral laws, yes. So I keep telling them, like, that you don't do away with culture, you don't do away with tradition, you don't go and take the oracles and bring them out and give them to the priest and say, burn it up. You understand? Because, okay, you talk about Jesus Christ, it's also an image. They tell you you're worshiping an image. You're worshiping, you know, this and that. And you have a statue. It's almost the same thing.
It is the same.
It's the same thing. So why are you going to get yours? Because all you have done is to represent God, to depict God in a way that, you know, you can relate to. And so why do away with one to embrace another one? And one of my grand uncles was a very, very powerful man. He's called the Igbo Omenukako. Omenukako is a performer. Somebody translates literally to a performer in lean times, austere times. Somebody who is able to, that, you know, has the means to do things when the economy is so bad, very difficult, you know. And he was a trader across the entire Igbo land in those days. So what I learned from him, because this is written history, it was documented, is that at a time when he was trading, he was going towards the port, the sea, you know, Bonny area. You know, he had gotten his wares, he was going to the sea, and he would trade, you know. He would trade potassium and stuff like that, raw materials for goods with the British people that are anchored at the sea. Because the Igbos refused to allow the Europeans to take over and trade and control and tax. They refused. They said, you stay. You stay in your ship and we'll give you whatever you want, and we, you know, they never allowed them to come in. And so as he was traveling, the bridge on the mission, the bridge on his route collapsed. And he landed in the river with all his wares and all the people, you know, the caravan, everybody carrying stuff for him, and they all went in there. So the book documented that he cried out. He said, alas, my God, the God and our forefathers, why have you allowed me to live a life of that is death is better than, you know, something of that nature, to live a life of despondency because he felt he has lost everything. And what I picked out from there, which is what I keep telling people, you don't have to do away with your heritage and tradition, is that he cried out and he said, our forefathers, he cried to our forefathers. But today, the church, as it is, they come and they tell you, you must not pour libation, you must not call upon your forefathers, that is, it's anti-Christian and all that and that. So, but I'm lucky enough to have read that book and that it was documented, and it is my own grandfather and granduncle who called on to our forefathers. So I'm hanging on to that.
Yes.
And I say, I'm not going to let that go. You understand? And I try to use that to educate the others that it's not wrong. You know?
Yes, you're on cue, Doc.
Yeah.
And what we show them sometimes is, when you go into the Bible, you talk about Abraham. He's dead. Isaac, he's dead. Esau, he's dead. Jacob, he's dead. Noah, he's dead. Lot. So they're worshiping ancestors in the Bible. All these people in the Bible are dead people. So they tell me, don't worship my ancestors, but I'm going to worship a stranger's ancestors. And so when you come at them through that door, they have to think real deep. Even Jesus is dead.
Yeah.
You know? So the Bible is all about ancestral worship. But they don't want you to worship your ancestor, your family line. And so you are right on it. Your grandfather left you that message to keep you strong, to understand. Like just around the corner, I'll introduce you to them. You will see all of my elders and grandpeople going back in the shrine I have for them right there. They go back to my great-great-grandfather, great-great-grandmother. Great-great-grandfather is from Uganda. Great-great-grandmother is from here, Native people and African people. And then on the other side, they're from West Africa. We don't know exactly where, but I assume the area we call Nigeria and Ghana from the way we all look. And I have all of them there. All the children in the house know how to come and ring the bell. Even the little one who's only 2, he knows to ring the bell and wake up the ancestors in the morning. When he wakes up the ancestors. And when it's time to give them fresh water and to set some rum for them, or like this was this Malcolm X day, and we put some food for them. Everybody in the house, including the littlest one, understand that's what we have to do. And when they go to bed to sleep at night, they make prayers to their ancestors, so that they know, that this is a part of who they are all the time.
Language is also very important. Yesterday I was on the phone with a Nigerian friend of mine. I called him up, but he happened to have moved from New York area to Nebraska. And so we started talking, and he was now talking about his kids and speaking of the Igbo language to them, and their mom not wanting them to learn or more, speaking English to them, and all that. So I told them language is very important, because in language you get to, it's better to translate things from your language to the English language than from the English language to your language, because in language you learn a whole lot that you didn't even know. You understand? When you give thoughts to certain things in the language, like in Igbo, when people have discord or differences, a person will say, they'll tell you, oh, if I'm greater than you, I'm greater than your God. And that's chi. There's something called chi. We have Chukwu, God, and we have chi. Chi is a personal God, which is more like what you call your destiny, or whatever you probably can make of your life is your chi. So if I'm greater than you, I'm greater than whatever is moving you in the path or direction that you're going, which is your personal God, and that you can get from language, you understand, because that is chi, is different from Chukwu. And also, there are so many things, like you talked about the title or the nickname that you have. We say that the name, that people tend to be their name. They kind of
attribute.
Yes, they get to, like I'm Eziokwu Ebunam, okay, and that it means the truth shall not kill me, and that makes me at all times, almost to my own detriment, want to tell the truth at all given time, and that is the name, the person becoming the name. Over time, you tend towards your name.
Yes.
And so in those nicknames, you'll see, I was telling him, I was trying to illustrate for him so that he can understand the reasons why he has to teach his children to speak the language. I told him, we have people whose nickname are, when the time is right, things happen naturally. In God's time, more, you can say, some people will say in God's time or this or that, but we say when it is complete, it happens. You understand? Naturally, when it's complete. And you might find out that the person who took this name, you call the name, but you wouldn't understand why he took the name. But when you start to observe the person's attitude in life, you probably find out that it is somebody who will give a little more, you understand, so that things will happen. He would not force issues. There are so many little things like that, and these are all parts of language, because these names come out of language, and they kind of try to, they're a store of values in a way.
It's the language becomes one of the main vehicles that carries culture into generations.
Yes.
It's like a tractor trailer truck or a cargo train. In those containers is the culture, all of the pieces of the culture. And so in the West, they've taught us that culture is dancing, it's music, it's theater. But in Africa, you're taught that these are tools of culture. They're not culture itself. These are cultural tools. The culture is the ideas by which the people live. And then you have the tools that express the ideas. And so language is one of those.
If I may, just because we're talking about an aspect of the history that I get a question from all the time. And in particular, my grandson was saying that in his school, they're teaching him that Africans sold themselves into slavery. And he focuses particularly on Nigeria because he's saying that the Nigerians were the ones who worked for the British to capture other Africans. because he know I go to Nigeria all the time, and he said, you know, Grandpa, I don't want to have nothing to do with the Nigerians because they're the ones who sold us into slavery. So I, for him, want to get some clarification and understanding.
It's a good question, but it's not quite.
Accurate.
No, it's not quite in the right time. I was just trying to frame my thought to take what Professor Small has said, what my brother Mbanowe has said, so it can complement what they said. And then you brought in ISPET. That's the opposite. And so we're not ready for that yet.
Okay.
But we'll take it on because it's important. When we have bits and pieces or even large information flows, we have to understand that it all needs to fit within what I would call a systems analysis. And so these brothers were trying to deal with the system flow coming out of African peoples, how they try to live their lives at the highest possible level. Slavery, no matter who was involved, is the negative component. And so we need to hold that into abeyance. Our great minds, we're not going to deny it, but our great minds, we're trying to get us to focus on our ancestral history. Even those that were so progressive that they were top world scientists, or they were so political that they were Marxist Leninists. But they knew that culture was the key component of understanding our history. So I raise this because one of our great scholars and great thinkers, Dr. check1, he tried to let us have a larger framework where we could understand the development of the various groups that found themselves in Nigeria, the development of groups that found themselves in other parts of West Africa, development of groups in East Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa, as well as Northern Africa. So you have such an enormous continent and such an important continent that you need a framework of analysis. And so what he provided us with was that everything has to be approached in terms of systems understanding and systems analysis. And so we were trying to deal with the cultural component, which was key. But the fundamental component is the economic aspect. All societies revolve around their creativity and their productivity. And that's what economics is all about. And you have to have a capacity for enhancing that economics and that politics. And that leads you to deeper cultural and political dimensions. So what Diep and others, and what I learned was that you got to link up the three components of systems: economics, your creative capacity, your productive capacity, politics, your management capability. Because if you are productive economically, it has to be managed, and if you're doing it over periods of time with large groups of people, it has to have a deep organizational structure. So politics is not what politicians do, it's what societies do to manage their economics. But your economics and your politics, your productive capability and your management, administrative capability, cannot serve the people unless, and cannot be fully understood, unless culture is the key component for understanding what type of economics you should have and who to do your politics with. So I would like people, when they get into these deep issues like we're discussing, to have that framework of analysis so that we won't have just what I call a paralysis of analysis, focusing on one thing, and we're not looking at the larger picture. We need to look at the larger picture. Slavery is a large picture. I don't want to start with Africans selling Africans. because that wasn't a slave system. It might have been slave historical incidents. But the slave system that you're talking about is a universal process. So it doesn't start with Europeans on the coast of Africa trying to induce Africans to have wars, to suck people down to the coast and put them into ships. You missed the systems component. In fact, people always talk about slave trade. No, it was a slave trade system. And so that's why I'm saying we're trying to deal with culture now to establish the foundation of the human family as having its deep African cultural understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the beauty of a check1. This man was a Marxist. He was a Marxist-Leninist. He was a Pan-Africanist. He came out of a deep Muslim tradition of the Morids. And then he got the best education that you could get out of Europe. But he put that all together with his previous formations, and he was able to take on the flow of history of the world. And the first 100 pages of his great master work deals with the African origin of humanity. That's a deep issue that has to be resolved. That no matter who's human on this planet, if you go back to the deep root, it's an African root. First 100 pages, he takes on world science and shows that over the last 175, 50 years, the scientific explosions have all established the African origin of humanity. Then for the next 100 pages, he deals with how humanity spread out of Africa to the world, and you had different manifestations of it taking place. He describes it as a southern cradle phenomenon and a northern cradle phenomenon, because they were responding to the ecological dimensions. And the great Wormian Ice Age, which we are in now, is something that has lasted 100,000 years. And so the environment affects how people react to it and create their economics and their political systems and their cultural systems. And the mysteries of the universe are the basis for deep cultural manifestation. What is this creation? Who is involved in this creation? Are there invisible forces in this creation? Does this creation of the universe have form and structure so that we can appreciate and understand it? So many of the cultural manifestations that we want to destroy each other on and have great fights have to come out of these mysteries that have not been fully understood. African peoples were the first to deal with the mysteries and the first to begin to try to understand them. And you can see that environment, as Professor Small was saying, played an important role. Because if you were along the Nile Valley or the river valleys of Africa, and those rivers overflowed, then in order for you to maintain your economics and your political structure and your culture, you had to go into these mysteries. Why are these rivers rising? And then why are they overflowing, destroying what we built? And then going back into the banks of the river, the cycle continues. So the cycle of change, transformation, rebirth, regeneration, renaissance comes out of understanding the cultural environment that you're trying to establish yourself in. And so that's why I say we need a framework of analysis before we deal with these great issues. 100 pages of the African origin establishes this great work. The next 100 pages deals with the northern cradle and the southern cradle. So Africans who caught up in the northern cradle and didn't get back into the southern cradle, it appears, evolved and manifested themselves into another aspect of humanity. And he lays that out very brilliantly. And then the final 100 pages, he deals with this scientific, spiritual, philosophical contribution in the Nile Valley. And so that's the end of the ball game. African origin, African evolution, African cradle of civilization. We've established who we are. And then if we want to go deeper into the aspect that developed in Nigeria, southern Nigeria, Western Nigeria, Northern Nigeria, the aspect that developed in the Cameroon, aspect that developed in other parts of West Africa. Brother Small has spent a lot of time dealing with the migrations and the movements. And he's touched on a very important thing, but he needs to get a National Geographic revelation called The Skeletons of the Sahara.
Hmm.
And it's an unbelievable dimension of our cultural linkages. And so just, and I'll get into that, but to put the framework of Diep saying, first and foremost, economics, your productive capability, politics, your management capability, and culture, the cement that keeps things together. So he felt that culture was so important that he had a small little chapter dealing with culture and what it means. So for this scientist to go deep as he has, it has opened up a whole view that we can use. As I said, Professor Small has been working diligently and seeing the movements out of the Nile valleys and across Africa. And as we begin to get into that, we come into not just the discovery of the temples and the pyramids and the literature that comes out, but as you move out of it toward West Africa, you find Netaplayo,
Mm-hmm.
a system of relating to the universe that has been laid out by Africans before the Nile Valley cultures. And so just most recently, they discovered the skeletons in the Sahara. And they're dealing with the time before the Sahara became a desert. And they're dealing with it in its water period. And so these scientists from the University of Chicago who specialize in dinosaur bones were looking for dinosaurs in the Sahara. And what did they discover?
Hmm.
Them dry bones of African people. Layers of dry bones. Thousands of bones. And along with the African bones were hippopotamus bones. So this was during the period where this area was,
Watery.
yes.
Very well. Yeah.
Then they found two large segments of different bones. One a dark type and one a whiter type that had been bleached. But it has nothing to do with color, it has to do with the impact of the environment.
Hmm.
But they found both sets of these thousands of bones showed the civilization of the Nile has its deep root in the Sahara.
Francis Botchway, who was an airway brother who was close to your father, close to Elias's father, matter of fact, worked with Malcolm, and he became Dr. Jeffrey's deputy director of Black Studies Department in the 70s at City College. And he was a good teacher of mine of Islam. He was a Muslim. Before he left City, when he left City, he went to teach in Indonesia, and he sent me some documents, which I can't find. It's in my papers.
Indonesia and Malaysia.
Malaysia, But Dr. Botchway, who's an ancestor now, sent me some documents that showed that the American satellites have not only see the great aquafet, there's a massive underground sea in the Sahara.
Yes.
And Muammar Gaddafi had tapped into that aquafet, and that's how he was providing fresh water to Libya. It's a whole sea down there that was once higher. But the thing that was really critical that Francis wanted me to see, that there was two rivers that ran from the Atlantic Ocean, one coming through what is now Nigeria, the other to what is Ghana, and going all the way over to Lake Chad, which then provided the obvious that many of the proponents of the civilization in the Nile Valley came from West Africa to begin with.
Right.
Because during the monsoon season, even now, you can almost navigate the rivers from the west into Lake Chad, even in a shrunken state, where it's shrunk by hundreds of miles over the decades, and then get into other tributaries and end up in the Nile. So imagine when Lake Chad was hundreds and hundreds of miles wider, and those tributaries, those rivers were above ground. One could see someone moving between what is now Lagos and Abydos in a season to visit family and to buy and exchange goods as your father was doing, and to bring those goods back all by river. And so those underground rivers that the satellites have discovered would change the whole dynamics of how we look at the development of Nile Valley civilization, which wasn't just in the Egypt that we know of today, but that civilization then ran all the way down into Uganda, through Sudan, into Uganda, such that you have one of the kings, I think it's the Ntoro kingdom, where he still wears the crown with the uraeus on his head, the young boy. He's in his 20s now. He's the king of I think the Ntoro people in Uganda. The key thing is that there's only one human race. Everything else is a mutation off of the African gene pool. It is a known fact that only the African woman has the mitochondria DNA to produce all other human species. No other woman has the mitochondria that can produce all other human except the African woman. Those are scientific facts now. And so when we look at our civilization, as our brother was talking about the laws of God, well, before there was a 10th commandment, there was the 42 admonitions of Ma'at, the 47 laws that our ancestors had put together. Out of those laws comes the 10. In the Nile Valley, Egypt, where Moses studied, and as even the Bible says, he was learned in all of the ways of the Egyptians. He had to master those 42. So he didn't have to go to the mountain to get the 10. The 10 was in the 42. But the mountain is a metaphor for the human mind, okay? The human consciousness. So, but if you don't understand metaphor, you will think mountain. But if you understand the metaphor, he had to go to a higher consciousness and then take 42 and shrink them to 10, because the population he was dealing with didn't have the capacity to master the 42. So how do you simplify it and make it basic? Then you'll understand the magic of Moses, you see. So, and then at the same time, you understand the magic of our ancestors to have built such an enormous institution that he could learn from, and then use that body of knowledge to help other people in the world. But then you would get a much more primitive people coming from Europe, seeing our system, not understanding what it is, taking it over, recasting it, and through their military dominance for economic purposes of Africa, reintroducing the system to us from their cultural perspective and their intellectual limitations. And thus we have Christianity and Islam as a result of that. And even Islam, which is a big factor in Nigeria in these days, and even for the long days, since the early days of the 1800s, when we had the great jihads with Shehu and the others who were fighting for good causes. They were not proselytizing in the way people are doing today. And so when they led the great jihads, they were trying to reintroduce certain principles. So if you look at Islam, and they will say in the Yoruba tradition, in the Igbo tradition, and the Yoruba tradition, you have gods. And people say, oh, in Islam, you don't have gods, you have Allah, subhanahu wa ta'ala, only the one. And they give you a whole prayer, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, Kul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalad, lam yalid, lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. Know that God is one, he begets, none knows he begotten. But nobody accounts for the 99 names, the pearls of faith, which is 99 qualities that make up Allah's divinity. They're the deities. But they won't call them deities. They said they're the 99 pearls of faith. But they're the 99 deities. And all societies realize that your capacity to comprehend the totality of divinity is beyond you. So the way you understand divinity is to understand its aspects and its essence as expressed in the different aspects. It is these aspects and essence we call our gods, our deities. And if we master them, to the degree we can comprehend and master them, is the degree to which we have embraced aspects of the divine essence as a part of our being in a daily basis, in a daily way. So our culture is so fantastic, it is so wonderful, just to be simple. If we could only find a new way to teach it to our young people, they will abandon the other ways. Because none of them will really make sense once they see something that really makes sense, you know. And so, and the history, when we talk about history, just day to day, looking at the conflicts around things economic, things politics, and things cultural, it all comes back down to the human aspirations for providing food, clothing, shelter, and security for yourself and your family.
Yes, please.
And how do you, then I'll come back to you.
Yes, at this juncture, I think I would like to make a comment, and in doing so, I first of all would like to say, you know, Dr. Jeffries, that naturally I have to defer to you for age, because that represents wisdom and knowledge. You had said that we shouldn't broach certain issues, you understand, and I know that there is some wisdom behind that. But also, having said that, I would like to draw on the philosophy of my dad,
Yes.
and that of Malcolm X, you know, who today lives on because he took on a challenge that still has outlived him.
Right.
And that's why we talk of him today. And so long as those things he fought for have not been, you know, actualized, he will live on. His name will go on and on and on. And that's the situation we find ourselves in today. And, you know, tying that to my father also had that type of philosophy. He always said that the most difficult we do right away, and the impossible takes a little longer. Okay, and Malcolm has embraced almost the impossible,
Yes.
and is still on and is still going. Therefore, I would like to return to the question that he asked. You know,
Yes.
regardless of, you know, it might be a bit digressive or not, you know, but I would like to go back to that point, because I believe that I haven't studied history, but I can draw inferences, you know. Part of the last things you said was that human nature has always tended towards sustenance. Everything we do depended much on survival.
Right.
And I think we can draw inferences of today. History always repeats itself. In trying to answer that question, I'll probably say that nothing much has changed from those days till today. Okay? Those people, it was not much of maybe the Africans wanting to benefit from the selling or doing away of their kith and kin into slavery. But I think it is more the other way around. The Europeans wanting so badly to advance their own economic ends, because it is like today. They probably saw, you know, the human resource then, like the way they see oil of today. And we know that they've had things that were called gunboat diplomacy, you understand? And as of today, it is coded. Everybody knows that America will go in and take the oil if they have to. If you don't give it to them, they're going to take it by force. And that's why they have a fleet, a flotilla of ships all over the world, guarding every oil deposits all around the world, keeping the channels of the flow of oil. Okay? And in those days, they were the ones who they have maintained. Today, okay, today the ability to wage war in all parts of the world is only a continuum of their ability in the past. They have only worked hard to sustain it. And therefore, I believe that they simply came in and took what they wanted.
When we're talking about people moving out of necessity, in the 1440s, when the Portuguese would first come down the coast of West Africa, what was first come down the coast of West Africa? What was happening in Europe? Europe had been into something that was called the Dark Ages. And it had been in the Dark Ages since the 6th century AD. What caused this Dark Ages? The Muslim empires had taken control of the entire Mediterranean basin from the Atlantic to the Black Sea, which cut Europe off completely from international trade and caused one of the world's first Great Depression to occur, which they refer to as the Dark Ages. But it was an economic depression that lasted from the 6th century until the 14th century. And so when Europe broke out, after getting certain knowledge about the wealth of Africa, Mansa Musa, the king of Mali, really, when he went on a pilgrimage to Mecca, the gold that he was giving and distributing to pay his way caused the entire economic system of Egypt to collapse because he introduced so much gold into the system. And when the Europeans learned that that kind of wealth was in Africa, the attempt was, how do we outflank these Muslims who had defeated all of our crusades and forced us into retreat? And they learned a story, it was a mythical story, of this great king, of this great nation. Remember, they don't know the extent of Africa at this point. But they learned that there's one great Christian nation in the world that the Muslims had never defeated, the nation of Ethiopia. And there was a mythical king of Ethiopia in their metaphor called Prester John. So the Portuguese was sailing west of Africa to get to the east, to make an alliance with Prester John, to outflank the Muslims militarily from the rear. That was what they were thinking. This is in their literature. For the purpose of trying to open up the trade routes back to China and India in the east. Because spice in those days was worth what oil and gold is worth today. Because Europe was a meat-eating culture. And to preserve your meat, you needed the cloves and the peppers and the other spices of the east, just to keep your food chain from rotting on you and causing disease. You needed salt for the preservation of this food. All of this was blocked off by a Muslim empire that was in control of international trade. And so in coming down the West Coast, they discovered the rest of us, living our life without any militaries. We didn't have armies. We didn't need armies. But they came out of a war culture, a survival war culture. And they met a people that were basically practicing husbandry. These were fishermen, farmers, and herdsmen. The best weapon we had was some little bow for shooting small prey for dinner. We had no standing armies. We did not have a culture, a war culture, except in North Africa, where the Muslim culture, the Arab Turk culture, had created a war culture among the Gudamas people and others who we call the Moors today. And so we were at a disadvantage even in our introduction. But what must be understood, once they made that incursion, and the first thing they do, the first Portuguese ship records that they kidnapped Africans and took them back to Portugal. This is their own records. But once the discovery of America occurs, and they find that there's land, they came looking for gold and silver, anything to develop their wealth. But when they discovered land where they could grow and carry out agriculture, but did not have the agricultural scientific knowledge to do so, that's when they came for us. The greatest husbandry and agrarian people on the planet Earth, they have become acquainted with us for some 50 years now. And so they didn't have to create a slave trade system, as Dr. Jeffries talked about. The Arabs and the Turks for 1,500 years was already running a slave trade system in Africa. And you can read it's in check1 when he talks about the Borneo kingdom, where on one occasion the emir of Borneo writes to the Turkish emir of Egypt and says, I thought we were both Muslims. I thought we were brothers. Why are you sending your armies down here to raid and kidnap my people and capture them and put them into slavery? This is an African Muslim now talking to a Turkish Muslim. Okay? And so the system of slavery in the Indian Ocean and the Sahara Desert has been going on for 1,500 years. So the West simply taps into the system. Okay? They tap into the system. We're being captured and marched across the continent to the Atlantic. And to the degree, there was a big conference at Princeton about 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And thanks to Dr. Brown, I had a chance to go to Princeton and become a part of that conference. All of the presenters, except Dr. Brown and myself, and then one of the brothers, were from the continent. Many of them were Igbos, and there was one Igbo sister, professor, who presented the most fantastic case from the records on how this thing worked. The Brits and the others would come with their armies, and even their Arab surrogates, Turkish surrogates by this time, to our villages. And they would go for months. And they would come to your village and say, I need 50 men and 20 women. I will be back in 30 days. Have them or I will take what I wish. They would go to Dr. Jeffries' village and says, I need this many persons. And they would go down the line, then they would come back in due season. If you didn't have those people, then your village got raided, burned, and you and whoever your family was gone. So now you're caught in a contradiction. And what ended up happening in most cases, there's a major war at this time in history. It begins in the 10th century, really in the 8th century when the Turks take over the Islamic system. By the 10th century, the Turk is in full control of the Islamic system, and they're going through, if you read the history and the literature, an ethnic cleansing of the Nile Valley, driving millions upon millions of people out, replacing them with the Serbs from Eastern Europe. And so you've got this massive, massive migration coming from the east into the west of refugees. We would call them refugees today. And believe it or not, they passed through Darfur as the main corridor to the west. Now, if you had to make a decision on who was going to be in shackles when the slave traders got there, was it going to be your auntie or your uncle, or was it going to be this camp of refugees who had no attachment to you, who was down the road or down in the bush? And so that began to happen, but not as often as one would think. Yes, and the other big resource was in the major Yoruba wars, because the Yoruba was a massive people. In the Yoruba wars, they had begun to sell their prisoners of war to the foreigners. But none of them had any idea of what chattel slavery was all about, or that it even existed as such in the context. Because what we saw as bondage in our societies, someone who was in bondage to us because of something, a debt or something else, had the opportunity to marry our daughters, had the opportunity to become the chief in the village, had the opportunity to become the king over that society. We didn't take away, and Dr. Jeffries taught us this, we did not take away the person's humanity. You know, we allowed that person to remain a human being. What we took away from is you have been taking from your society. You are now a member of our society. But you still have your humanity to grow in this society to the same extent that we can grow in this society if you prove yourself. What chattel slavery did was to take away our humanity. And so when we really look at the system and their own records, they left so much records. The one thing about that European money, he had to account for money. He left records. That Arab left records. They even drew paintings and pictures showing you how they capture us. And they made sure to paint themselves wearing their turbans and their white robes while we were without shirts and so forth. When they shackled us and raided our villages, they made these lithographs and these drawings themselves. So we have the history to look upon. So don't tell me I sold myself into slavery. That doesn't even fit my culture. It doesn't fit my value. It doesn't fit my morals. I was in a war, and we had to make a decisions in many occasions who would go. There were even occasions when there were those who volunteered to go rather than have the village destroyed. And so we must study our whole history and how we kept the cultural and spiritual humanity as we went forth into the world with the hope that we would make it back home eventually. So you really, when you look at the system of slavery, we had no part in running any part of the system. We were an unwilling adjunct forced by military and weaponry to participate to whatever degree we were participating. Dr. Jeffries had even showed us once, I think if you can remember, when you were telling us about the cargo and the ships that was coming in the so-called triangle trade, the ships coming from Africa from Europe going to Africa, they had the barrels of rum, but in the manifest was also opium. So what they were doing was putting opium in the rum. So the African leaders may have thought they were drinking rum, but they were getting a form of crack back in the day. So we got to look at all of these things to see the diabolical mind. And they were doing it for the purpose of getting agricultural workers and miners and laborers to build in this new land they had conquered from the native people called the Americas. And they went to where they found the people who had the most skill. My family come from a place in South Carolina where we live on the rivers, where the rice fields, and we worked, part of my family worked during slavery in these rice fields. And to this day, most people don't realize that the rice that made America wealthy before tobacco and before indigo, that rice was an African rice, not a Chinese rice, not an Asian rice. This is African rice. When we talk about Carolina rice, we're talking about an African rice. We had 2 dry land rice and 1 wetland rice. You know? And so they knew nothing about rice. They saw us, we had smuggled them, the women smuggled them in their dresses and apron. And they saw us eating this white starchy thing, you know, giving ourselves the carbohydrates we needed. And they didn't know what it was. When they figured out what it was, my God, they went crazy. And so rice was called in America white gold. But to make rice work, you had to go to West Africa for the rice scientist, the rice architect, and the rice specialist. And you had to capture them and bring them to the Americas. So when we look at the slavery thing, it isn't just, it's not some work program that we signed up for. You know, this was war.
It was war.
But it was war but it was a system that had been in place for thousands of years, but had now been perfected in the last 1,500 years by the groups we call the Turkish Muslim Empire, under the Umayyads and the Abbas Caliphates. And then you would have the West come in with the Portuguese first and then followed by all the other European nations. So when we put it in that kind of context, you see when they make foolish statements like that, you laugh at them, you know, and push them away.
And one of the interesting contradictions in the slave trade system history is that the Jewish population has always been caught in between these great forces. And there is a period of the history where you had the slave trade was centered in Eastern Europe among the Slavic peoples.
Mm-hmm.
And you actually have the term slavery coming out of Slavic people.
Yeah, this is Bosnia, Herzegovina.
That's right. Yugoslavia,
Yugoslavia, you know.
Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, that whole Central and Eastern European landmass.
Just hold your thought. One of the greatest leaders of the Islamic world that end up defeating the English king and turning back the Crusades was a grandchild of the Slavic people mixed with the African people. His name was Salahuddin.
Okay.
Is it?
Yes. And so most people don't understand that before you were talking about the transatlantic slave trade in reference to Africa, you got to deal with the north, the Saharan trade slave, and the east, the Indian Ocean slave trade. But even before that, the great struggle between Islam and Christianity, Crusades involved enslavement, and this is really ironic, that as the Western European converted to Christianity in France and Italy and Spain and Portugal, the Slavic peoples were pagan. And Jewish merchants who had been dealing in the Mediterranean slave and the Asians, the Mediterranean trade and the Asian trade, Jewish merchants became the managers for Christian Europeans selling other Europeans that are non-Christian into Arab slavery. So there's a triangle of European Christians selling other European non-Christians into slavery, and this was facilitated by Jewish trade merchants to Islam. Now see, once you unravel that, you've got a much deeper thing than Africans bringing some people down to be waiting. And I say that if we just focused on, because James knows, Professor Small knows that I deal with slavery as a forward
creation of the House of Rothschild
right,
and the Habsburg Empire.
slavery as a four-way profit system. And the four-way profit system involved Europeans coming out of their dark ages in the age of chaos and confusion, where their economics, their politics, and their culture had been fractured. Economics had collapsed after the fall of the Roman Empire. And so it took them hundreds of years to get an economic foundation back into place. And then the conflict over ruling this economics was tied to a stifling economic political system called feudalism. So it didn't have the dynamics that would later come to change this feudal system, which tied everything to the land. It even tied sex to the land. That the feudal lord owned everything, and his manor was the static economic base of the society. And so he even had the right of first night. That if a maiden in the southern part of his manor fell in love with a young man in the northern part of his manor, and their families agreed that they should marry, the lord of the manor had the right of first night. So they even took the virginity of marriage and put it in the hands of a lord. So this structure, economically, politically, and culture, was a stagnation. And that's when you have the Dark Ages. And then the dynamic relationship of Islam emerging, and then that structure now having to move out of its static position. So you had 500 years of wars back and forth from 1096 to 1492. Before there was a transatlantic slave, you have this process of feudal Europe and a dynamic Islam clashing, producing enslaved folks. So we do not deal at all in our history with the white slave trade.
Right.
Hundreds of years this slavery existed before we came into contact with the European slave trade. Now, in order for the slave trade to be, it had to have an economic dimension, a political dimension, a cultural dimension. And so that economic, political, cultural dimension becomes the joint chartered companies that were set up to manage enslavement.
Yes.
So I say that slavery did not start in an African village up north, and people were brought down to the southern, the south, and they waited for ships that's not slavery, that's captivity. Slavery was conceived in the boardrooms of the Europeans that we think of the transatlantic slavery. And so initially the Portuguese and Spanish, because they had this enormous fight with Islam, were the founders of the slave trade system, with the popes giving them the blessing to do it. Dr. Miller always cited those Pope something something the sixth, Pope something something the fourth, that issued decrees that the non-Christian population, infidels, could be enslaved. So the system gets its foundation from the Catholic Church and the popes. And that's in the 1400s. And then it emerges and expands as it reaches into Northern Europe and other parts. And you get the Christian system fracturing itself, and it becomes Roman Christianity and Northern European Protestantism. So that's the 1600s. So the Portuguese and the Spanish set up the joint stock companies in the 14 and 1500s. But the Northern European, the English, the Dutch, and the Germans, the Danes, the Swedes, perfected this economic system by producing the Dutch East Indian Company as the first model in 1601 of this new economics and this new exploitation. And you're talking about the Dutch all the way in Indonesia and in China, Gao, and the Portuguese were there, and the Dutch took that over, and they had greater technology in the sea and greater ability to handle arms. So you have to look at that dynamic before you can even begin to look at the transatlantic slave trade. So I'm saying it starts in the minds of the European in Spain and Portugal. It expands into Northern Europe, so it goes into Amsterdam, Rotterdam, England, London, Bristol. It goes into Hamburg and Germany. It goes into Copenhagen. And each of these entities that were emerging wanted a joint stock company. Now, a joint stock company is not just an economic enterprise. It has a charter that they can take lands and steal people's wealth. They also had a military component, that these fleets of boats also had their military component, and it had a cultural component that this was a manifestation of the emerging consciousness of what we call white supremacy. And so until you can see some of that, you can't understand what the system meant. Profits made in fitting out the companies in the boardrooms and setting up the prototype, the Dutch West Indian Company, East Indian Company, 1601. Then in 1621, they set up the Dutch West Indian Company when they began to move on West Africa. They were so successful that the Danes said in 1637, I need a company. So the Jews and Dutch, you all come up here to Copenhagen and help me set up a company. Swedes wanted to get a part of it. In 1649, set up the Swedish African country. Johnny come latelys in the thing are always the Germans. But before the Germans, 1651, the British wanted their company. Then they transformed that company. It wasn't as efficient as they wanted. They set up in 1672 the Royal African Company. And then in the 1682s, the Brandenburg Germans said, we want a part of the pie. Just as Bismarck came in late to call the people, I want a part of the colonial empire. Before that, the Germans had to get a part of the pie, and as they set up the Brandenburg slaving system. So unless you put in the slaving system that were paramilitary structures, parapolitical structures, and had their own cultural dominance, you can't understand the system. And we refuse to deal with Europe. So the Africans would still be standing on the shores of Africa if this component was not there.
Well,
They had no
you-
plantations in the New World, and so we're talking about fitting out the ships, that's the first profit, and putting in, as you mentioned, the guns and ammunition so you can encourage Africans to fight each other. Rum was a big product, as Brother Small says. The Dutch mastered how you could take sugar and rum and create the beginning of crack.
So, I would like for Dr. Jeffries at this point to come from where you just came and bring it right into the Berlin Conference, if you can do that for us.
Okay, this is just like illustration of what he has said regarding, because the key thing here is that the Europeans had the army, okay? And they've had this army, they've done what they wanted to do with the armies for many centuries, plundered Africa, took the Africans away and every sort of thing like that. And in so doing, demonstrated their might, military might. And part of that, to illustrate this and what they had done and their power and their ruthlessness will be the case of when, after having done everything they wanted to do from their own shores, sending in armies and ships and everything, they decided with the trading companies to establish in Africa directly. They now had representatives, a base in Africa. Okay, then they set up. Some powerful kings resisted, like King Jaja, and they set up protectorates. Okay, eventually, with the greed that they've always exhibited, one of the people there decided, oh, I want to start taking taxes. I want to establish a system and lord it over these people. And they started to wage war, starting from the north all the way down to the south. Benin, the Yoruba, and came into Igbo land, which by extension is the Bonny area, the oil rivers and everything. And when they got there, and King Jaja said, wait a minute, I thought I was an independent entity, and that I only signed a treaty of you protecting me because you have the warships and everything, And they said, oh yeah, he wrote the Queen, because the guy of the let's say the president of the Royal Trading Company, Royal India Trading Company, African Trading Company, had turned, metamorphosed from being a trading company into a government.
Yes.
You understand? He had turned into a government, and they said, and so King Jaja said, no. You can't. I'm the king here, and I'm in control of this place. You stay out there, and we trade. Okay, we are not going to pay you taxes and everything. So what I'm trying to do is to buttress the fact that they take whatever they want. Is a conquest. It was basically a military conquest that took place. King Jaja was called to a meeting on a warship. He was called to a meeting, and when he was going there, he didn't know it was a warship. He went, as he was approaching the ship, he saw guns turned on him. Artilleries were turned on him, and he couldn't go back. They took him on the ship and took him straight to the Caribbean. He was exiled, and he never came back to Nigeria. He died in Ghana after the end of the slave trade, when he was released. You understand? And he was on his way back, and he died. He caught some ailment and died. And so this illustrates their methodology. You understand? You either give it to them or they take it. So that's that particular case, which is documented also, illustrates how the modus operandi of the Europeans and the Western world at that time. The Queen sent a warship, said, "Come in, let's negotiate, let's talk this thing over." As soon as he arrived there, he was bounded in and taken. I think he was taken to, it wasn't Jamaica, but somewhere.
Barbados.
Barbados, here, he was exiled by force, and then that was how they got in and took over that area, the eastern oil rivers and the Igbo land.
We have another female comrade here. You should at least peek in and say hello and wave to the people of Birmingham. This is Sister Eliasa Shabazz. Would you like to make some comment? She's not just Sister Eliasa Shabazz. She's the daughter of Sister Betty Shabazz and Brother Malcolm X. She's a prolific author in her own right, an extraordinary lecturer. It makes me very proud of her, by the way, because she learned to be like really powerful lecturer, and a great teacher. You know, and a great teacher.
Dr. Jeffries.
So I feel like she's one of my daughters, and so we want to say hello to Birmingham and just tell the people of Birmingham we hope you have an enormous African Liberation Day and that you enjoy this African Liberation Day and teach the people.
That's right.
Teach
It's
the people.
absolutely important. The liberation, the re-liberation of our people. Absolutely important. And I have to say, when I was a child, I always said, "Mommy, I want to be this, I want to be that." And then I wanted to be 4 or 5 different things, and I saw Dr. Jeffries' program on Like It Is, and I said, "Oh, Mommy, I want to be a philanthropist." And she said, I'm sorry, an anthropologist. And my mother said, "Oh, Lord." So just an absolute profound impact, you know, to the re-liberation of everything about us.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, your mother was a special spirit that moved among us with the great obstacles she faced and the burden she faced. We really appreciate. We really appreciate her. And she never hesitated to grab me by the collar and say,
She was a
"Dr.
tough
J,
cookie.
find the good and praise it."
Amen.
That was
And nobody can shut me down. Dr. J tries to shut me down sometimes. But Dr. Shabazz, we went to Grenada to celebrate your grandma's birthday once. And she and I went into St. George's, I think the area was called, where your grandma was born.
St. George's,
And we went to the square. So I decided I'm with Sister Betty Shabazz, so I'm going to act like her husband. I'm going to with Malcolm X. And I went to Raven and and afterwards she said, "Come in." She said, "Look, I didn't bring you down here to get you and me killed." She said, "You better learn how to do this. Give the people the message without antagonizing an enemy that you're not strong enough to go up against." That changed my whole, just that last sentence, that you're not antagonizing an enemy that you're not strong enough to go up against. I was like, whoa. Because at first I was going to say she's a scaredy cat, but once you threw that last sentence in there, I was like, okay, that makes sense. And I got it. You know, I really got it. But Dr. Betty Shabazz was the most extraordinary teacher. People don't know how extraordinary. I tell people, but when Study Carson told me, Colin says, this is a Bubadika. They're marching in Brooklyn to create Malcolm X, that's the Malcolm X Street. The cops is blocking the street. They're coming past Medgar Evers. Your mother was in the window watching this, and the cop stops everybody. It was going to be a clash. She walks down and gets at the head of the march, and everything just, oh God, that's Dr. Betty Shabazz. And they moved out of the way and allowed that to happen. A lot of people don't even understand the work your mother did. Like at the end of every May 19th, we would meet at Charles Memorial. That was the last stop before she came home to you guys. But she would have already traveled to Detroit, to Newark, wherever there was a Malcolm X school, she would have been there helping to fundraise.
That's right.
And she would culminate it at Charles Memorial School. And Ozzy would come, Ozzy Davis would be there sometime, Ruby would come sometime, and other celebrities would come to help her raise money for that school. And at the end of the day, that's when she would go home. And by then she would be tired because she would have been on the road for about a week or so. People don't understand how extraordinary those people who dedicate themselves to African liberation really are about. And so for me, for the people of Birmingham, my brothers and sisters, Beanie, and all of you over there who I'm going to miss very much, and the good food, Dee, that your wife made every night, and, you know, sitting around the table talking about how well the program went or how well it didn't go that day. I think we've given you enough information that you should be able to teach the people well. And introduce you again to Brother Ibadaway. And if you want to make some comment on African Liberation Day for the people of Birmingham, England, my brother, too.
Well, I would like to say that I hope you all have a dedicated and a very important day. I would say keep hope alive. It's a struggle. It's now a struggle for humanity, not just us alone, the Africans. The entire world is almost in bondage, and it's important that we all are free because we are born free, and therefore what you're doing is very important, and I want you to do it with all your heart and might and mind, and work hard to being free and stay free. God bless you all.
Thank you, brother. And Dini and the community and all my brothers and sisters and my favorite roommates and everyone. I like staying at your house. You got the most comfortable couch. But the food is impeccable. And that's a part of celebrating African Liberation Day, being with brothers and sisters from all around the world. But also let you know that we still believe in freedom or death. We believe in the mantra of Dessalines. But he says it's liberty or death. We have no other choice. And my great master teacher, Hajj Malik Al-Shabazz, whose birthday we celebrated yesterday on May 19th, Malcolm was very clear to us that education was an essential part of how we would liberate our people. And when he said any means necessary, he didn't reduce it to one means of violence. He said any means, and we must learn how to explore all means for African liberation, especially to get our kids tooled and skilled and trained to bring those tooling and the skill and the training back home to our communities in medicine, in science, and other technical skills, and communication skills, so that we can build our societies, so that we can control the economic and politics and culture where we live, whether we are on the continent or off of the continent. And so some of the history we've given you today, we hope that history lets you understand that we are people who have never ever give up. We've always fought, we've always fought. And even Robespierre, when he was there in the UK, having a good life, it was the Zulu nation under Secheweya that destroyed the British Army then in South Africa, that caused the fall of the British government in London, because the Africans so defeated them, And remember again, if we look right after the Berlin Conference, when they send General Gordon into Sudan to destroy the army of Muhammad Ahmed, in 3 days, Ahmed removed 10,000 British and Egyptian Turkish troops, and almost again caused the collapse of the British government because they killed their favorite general, Gordon. So we've always fought for African liberation. We've never capitulated. Our war of resistance for the integrity of our ancestors has always existed and will always exist. And it will always be freedom or death. That is our mantra as a people, as an African nation. We have never tried to imperialize or imprison any other people, but we resist imperialism, colonialism, neo-colonialism, and imprisonment of our people in the past and now. And so I hope we work well, work hard, teach well, teach hard, teach the children the history, teach the children the culture. We must know our ancestors. We must never ever forget those ancestors, because they have deposited themselves in us. Not as us, they have deposited themselves in us. And then as we grow, they deposit themselves as us. We are our ancestors. We are those ancestors. And it is our duty to make sure the next generation have more freedom and more opportunity than the generation that we live in. So African Liberation Day isn't a fantasy time. African Liberation Day isn't about a complete model. African Liberation Day is the aspiration that the whole world one day, because Africans live in every corner of the planet, that the entire world will be free for humanity to exercise their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness on this planet. So thank you, brothers and sisters in Birmingham.
That's beautiful.
And I think I want Ilyasa to come take Dr. Jeffrey's seat for a quick minute. I want Sister Ilyasa, she's your surprise guest today. Even God surprised me because I didn't know she was coming to visit. So Sister Ilyasa Shabazz, the daughter of Malcolm X, Betty Shabazz, you can make a closing statement to the brothers and sisters of Birmingham, England. Sister Shabazz.
I just think it's very important that we honor our ancestors by being the best that we can possibly be. As Brother Jeffrey said, by any means necessary, which is not reduced to one means, but every means that we have the capacity to be, to do. And that, right?
That's correct. Very much so. And so that's what it is. At the end of the day, we know that our existence on earth is for a day-to-day living, and what matters the most is how we live on a day-to-day basis, and the strength and the power that we have is to see that we put out our best in order to achieve our aims and objectives. Like Dr. Small had already said, is for us to work hard, be good, put out our best foot at all times, and have very strong moral and fortitude, or what, you know.
That's right.
At all given times, you know, we do our best, because that is actually the objective. The objective is for us to be free to do all that is necessary for us to have a good life. And so education, commerce, industry, what have you, these are the goals that we should focus on. It is not about a physical fight, it is not about carrying arms, it is about
Self-love.
yeah,
Self-love, strong leadership.
that's what it is.
And to make sure that we let our people know, in order to provide the essentials, food, clothing, shelter, safety, we must control land, we must control resources, and we must reintroduce our culture as our ethical moral guide. So Birmingham, enjoy your weekend, enjoy African Liberation Day. We love you very much. We wish we were there with you, but we're happy that we can send you this short message. Peace and blessings, you know, aluta continua.